Well, look at that, right on time. I love being on time. So welcome everyone. My name is Lior Samfiru. I'm the employment lawyer. I'm a partner and the head of the employment law practice at Samfiru Tumarkin LLP. We're one of the biggest employment law firms in the country. We operate in Ontario, in BC, and in Alberta. And why am I here? Well, I'm here to do this live session to answer your questions about workplace rights, to answer your questions about everything you need to know about your job security, your rights now with vaccines. I know we're going to get a lot of questions today about vaccines, mandatory vaccines. Can your employer impose that? Can you refuse? Do you have to be vaccinated? What does this all mean to you? Ask your questions. I'm live, you're live, and I'm here for one reason and one reason only, to answer questions. I see questions coming. I'm going to get to those in just a second. Bring them on today for the next half hour. So again, I'm Lior Samfiru, employment lawyer, and today this is about you. If you lost your job, are worried about losing your job, if your job has changed, if you're on a layoff, whatever the issue, the problem, or the ultimatum that someone has put in front of you, now is the time to get answers to those questions. Of course, if you want to connect with me off air, if you want to find out more about your legal rights, easy. All you do is you go to employmentlawyer.ca. Again, employmentlawyer.ca. You can read lots more about vaccines, about your legal rights. And of course, you can get my email address there, my phone number there. There's a form if you want to fill out so that we can connect and have a private chat off air. So take advantage of that. I'm going to answer questions right now. You ask your questions. Let's get to it, guys. Let's make sure you get answers. First question from Nights on Facebook. I work at a university in Ontario that is mandating the vaccine. I don't want to take it. What's my options? So first of all, Nights, question is, are you part of a union? If you're part of a union, you have to talk to the union. The only one that can answer the question what you have to do if you're part of a union is your union. Has to be the union. If you're not part of a union, legally speaking, the university may not actually be allowed to impose this vaccine. That means that ultimately, if you lose your job because you refuse, not only would you be entitled to severance, there may be even human rights damages owing to you. So there's no way to really physically stop your employer from mandating this vaccine. But what you can do is potentially get human rights damages, because arguably a mandatory vaccine policy, if the vaccine is mandatory, unless there's a government mandate, it's not going to be legal. It potentially is a human rights violation. All right, so you can't stop them, but you may be owed damages if you lose your job in this situation. First thing you do is you call us, okay? You go to employmentlawyer.ca. You'll see the number there to reach out to me, to my team. Again, employmentlawyer.ca. Very important question. I know we're going to be getting a lot more about mandatory vaccines, guys, so ask away. Now is the time. From Diana Taylor, what's the city of Toronto can fire me if I don't take the shot? So if the city of Toronto has announced that they're going to let someone go if they haven't had the shot, as I was saying before to our previous gentleman there, it's arguably not legal to do that. That means if they do let you go, you may be entitled to human rights damages. You're also going to be entitled to severance, potentially as much as 24 months. Now, that, of course, is assuming you're not part of a union. If you're part of the union, only one that can help you is the union. And if the union says ultimately, too bad, can't do anything, you're stuck. That's the problem with being part of a union. If you're not part of a union, you need to reach out to me if you lose your job. Talk to your employer about working from home. Talk to your employer about other options. If you ultimately lose your job, that may be illegal, okay? Which means human rights damages may be owed. Next question from Tammy. My company is making vaccinations mandatory. See, I couldn't, Dan, I couldn't see that the rest of the question from Tammy because it disappeared on my screen. So let me try to take Stacy's question. My employer is requiring everyone to do a mandatory iLearn course, but they ask twice if you have received the vaccine, and at the end of the iLearn, ask again. I tried to communicate with the union and no response per usual. Do I have to complete this iLearn? So unfortunately, Stacy, because you're part of a union, you have to do ultimately what the employer says unless your union says otherwise. When you're part of a union, unfortunately, you're stuck. You have to do what the union says, and if the union doesn't help you, you can't really do anything on your own. All right. So for many employees that are affected by the vaccine mandated vaccine, if you are part of a union, you have to follow up with your union. You can't do anything on your own. I can't help you. So you have to remember that. All right. So Tammy's question was, my company is making vaccination mandatory and my union is supporting it. So you are stuck in that situation, Tammy. That's the problem with being unionized. You can't deal with your rights on your own. It has to be your union, okay? Next question comes from Mark. Can my employer put me on a performance improvement plan for disagreeing to get a vaccination? No, they cannot. That makes no sense because it has nothing to do with your performance. And despite the fact that, listen, I think vaccinations are great. I think everyone should be vaccinated, but it doesn't matter ultimately what I think. What matters is what the law says. And legally, you can't be forced to be vaccinated unless there's a government mandate. So no, you can't be put on a performance improvement plan. That's nonsense, but I wouldn't worry about it because it's so nonsensical that it's not really going to hurt you, all right? It's like putting you on a performance improvement plan because you took the bus instead of driving to work. It makes no sense, all right? It has nothing to do with your performance. So an employer that does that would absolutely just be very, very silly, frankly. So thank you for that question, Mark. Guys, ask your questions about your employment rights right now. I will answer them. And of course, to connect off air, employmentlawyer.ca. Again, employmentlawyer.ca. But that's after. Right now, we are live. I'm live. Ask your questions. From Higgins Sharon. If I refuse the vaccine, my work says I have to test twice per week and wear a mask at all times. Do I legally have to do the tests and masking? I work at a bank. The reality is that, yes, the law would allow regular masking or a regular vaccine test in that situation. So even though your bank can't force you to get vaccinated, they do have leeway in terms of COVID tests and masking. So there's not going to be much you can do about that because they're giving you that option. They can't say you have to be vaccinated or you're out of here. Okay, that could be a human rights violation. But they can say if you don't get vaccinated, sure, no problem, but you have to have regular COVID tests. Our courts would consider that to be a reasonable alternative. So there's not much that can be done about that, Higgins. Now, okay, let's continue. Lots of questions coming in today. Next question from Marius on Facebook. Is asking about my vaccination status legal? Can I answer that due to health privacy, I decline to answer? I'm not part of a union. So generally speaking, certainly in Ontario, it's not legal to ask. We have an Occupational Health and Safety Act that says you cannot ask for personal, private medical information. But the question that you have to decide ultimately, Marius, is do you want to get into a fight, into a dispute with your employer over this, or do you want to just tell them? Ultimately, you cannot be legally fired for cause if you don't answer the question. You cannot. Okay? Your employer may say that, well, we have to assume that if you're not answering that you're not vaccinated, so we're going to make you do regular COVID tests. That would be reasonable. They can't fire you for not answering, certainly not for cause, and they cannot fire you for not being vaccinated. Again, not for cause, unless there's a government mandate. If there is a government mandate that applies to you, to your job, then yes, at that point, the employer can ask because they don't have a choice. The government says that they had to do it. So the first question always when it comes to mandatory vaccines is this: is there a government mandate that applies to me? If the answer is yes, there is, then your employer can't do anything about it. There's not much that you can do. If there isn't a government mandate that applies to you, it's very problematic and potentially illegal for an employer to decide that they're imposing mandatory vaccines. So number one question, is there a vaccine mandate, a government vaccine mandate that applies to you? Let's see, next question. Next question is from Kim. If my employer is doing COVID rapid testing, can I refuse? And can they discipline me for refusing? Arguably, yes, Kim, they can. Even though, as I said, requiring a vaccine may be potentially illegal. Requiring regular COVID tests or quick tests, rapid tests, is something that they can do. And even if you're let go, you are going to be owed severance, but it wouldn't be an illegal termination as long as they pay you the severance that you're owed. So they won't be able to let you go without severance. And remember, Kim, severance could be as much as 2 years' pay. You would have to get severance, but they could legally let you go with severance if you refuse to get a test or a regular test. Next question from Alicia. Last year in November, a manager came up and was scamming and screaming in a very loud voice because a customer told him I didn't have mask on right. I told my manager I could wear a mask over my nose, panic attacks, take medication for it, then I walk. Okay. I'm not sure I understand the question, Alicia. I'm not sure that it's written correctly. I don't know exactly what the issue is. So you may want to rephrase so that I can understand the question. Next question is from Magdalena. Coercive, aggressive behavior towards non-vaccinated employees is simply too much. Many things are not legal, but somehow are exercised at workplaces. Are you suggesting to start talking to you now before this government makes this mandatory? All I'm saying is this: if your employer is imposing mandatory vaccines when there isn't a government mandate, that potentially is illegal. So if you are let go because of that, that termination may be illegal. And then we need to speak if that happens. Of course, we need to speak right away. If there is a government mandate that tells your employer, too bad, you have to have your employees vaccinated. At that point, if you don't get vaccinated and you lose your job, there may not be anything that you can do. So all I'm saying is you have to determine first if there is a government mandate that applies to you. Now, in Ontario, just be clear, right now, we do not have mandatory vaccines. There's no government mandate. There's a mandate that says that if you don't get vaccinated, you have to get regular COVID tests every week. But right now in Ontario, there is no requirement. There's no legal requirement by the government to get a mandatory vaccine. So because of that, any employer that decides to do it, that could potentially be illegal. So that's something you have to understand. In BC, for example, there is mandatory vaccines in certain sectors that the government has imposed, but not in others. So depending, in Alberta, there's no mandatory vaccines at all. So it depends the province that you're with. Tatiana says, isn't there a federal workers mandate in place already? I'm confused. No, there isn't. The federal government said that they will be implementing a mandate for people that work for the government, not federally regulated necessarily, but they work for the government, the federal government, and they work in transportation, aviation, railway, marine. For those individuals, there's going to be a mandate. We don't know yet what that mandate exactly is going to say, but that's what they've announced, but it's not yet in effect. It doesn't apply to other federally regulated employees like banks, for example. So there is going to be a mandate, we've been told, but we don't know exactly what that is for those that work for the government, okay? Hopefully that helps help you understand. Tara asks, what about the GNA Act of 2017? Never heard of it. Razor Sharp, are existing vaccinations mandatory in the workplace, like the ones we receive as children? No, there aren't any. Now, in some jobs, for example, ambulance workers have to have certain vaccines like the ones you had in children, but not in other workplaces, okay? So right now, there isn't a mandatory vaccine, for polio or chickenpox. Those don't exist, but they do exist for ambulance workers and some other hospital workers. They already have that in place, but most people don't. Next question is from Higgins Sharon. Isn't it discriminatory to non-vaccinate people to only test the non-vaxxed when the vaccinated can carry and spread? Seems like bullying. Well, it is potentially discriminatory. That's exactly what I've been saying for the last 15 minutes. It's potentially discriminatory to require a vaccine. But because science still tells us that a vaccine is a good way to stop the spread or reduce it, to require testing is still okay. There's enough of a reason to do that, and it's not as intrusive as requiring a vaccine. That yes, the overall feeling is that human rights tribunals and courts will allow that. So I would not feel comfortable at all challenging mandatory tests That's very different than mandatory vaccines, which could absolutely be illegal, okay? Tammy asks, guys, we're getting lots of questions today, as I expected that we would. Ask your question. Whether it's vaccine, doesn't have to be about vaccines, by the way, but certainly whatever your employment law issue is, let's talk about it. Tammy says, I work for a federally regulated industry, telecommunications in BC. My union is supporting mandatory vaccines. What are my rights? Well, as I was saying earlier, Tammy, because your union is supporting it, it won't do anything about it. There's not much that you can do, all right? Unfortunately, there's not much at all that you can do. So because of that, when you're part of a union, you live and you die by the union, nothing that you can do. It's unfortunate. Tara posted something very long. I'm not going to be able to read this. And unfortunately, Dan, whatever Tara just posted, pushed all my questions off my screen, so I cannot see them right now. So anything before Tara's questions, I can't see. From Carol, did the Ontario government mandate vaccines for educators and healthcare workers? No, actually, they have not. What they've mandated is if you have not been vaccinated, then you have to go through this training, and then if you still refuse to be vaccinated, you have to have regular COVID tests. So the Ontario government has not said that if you're not vaccinated, you lose your job. Not at all. Okay, so there isn't a mandatory vaccine that the Ontario government has implemented. Potentially mandatory COVID tests if you have not been vaccinated, but that's it. So if your employer still maintains that you have to be vaccinated or else, that could be a human rights violation. Okay, very important. Let's see. Anita asks, is it mandatory for vaccines in BC for first on-site restoration companies? No, it's not at this point. So if an employer chooses to make the vaccine mandatory on their own, that could potentially be illegal. So the government has not made that mandatory as of yet. Keep in mind, things change, and tomorrow it can change. But as of right now, you're talking about on-site restoration companies. No, that would not be mandatory as of now. Salvatina says, Salvatina, if you're a nurse, you have to talk to your union. That's the only thing that you can do. There's nothing else you can do. And if your union doesn't support you, then unfortunately you're done. That's the problem with when you're part of a union. You don't have rights. The union has rights, and because of that, then you have to follow what the union says. Let's see. Are pay stubs from Hanny? Are pay stubs required by law in Alberta? Yes, they are. Absolutely. So as I said, if you want to connect with me about your issue off air, if you have a problem, you lost your job because of the vaccine or for any other reason, you need to connect with me to have a private discussion. Easy. You just go to employmentlawyer.ca. Again, employmentlawyer.ca. You can read more about vaccines, about legal rights, about severance, about employment law. And of course, you can also connect with me through their phone number, email. It's all there, employmentlawyer.ca. Martha asks, what would be the reasoning behind the employer mandating the vaccine? Well, I think that's obvious. I think it's simply because the employer feels that that's the best way to keep the workplace safe. But despite that, as I said, it may still be illegal because having COVID is considered a disability. COVID is a disability. Therefore, if you are, as an employer, distinguishing between people with a disability and those without a disability, that could be discriminatory. If you think that someone that doesn't have a COVID shot may be sick or could be sick with COVID, and that's why you don't want them in the workplace, arguably that's discriminatory. So that's why for an employer to impose a mandatory vaccine policy when there isn't a government mandate, that's a problem, and that could be a human rights violation. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. So again, what is the first step? First step, you ask yourself, is there a government mandate that applies to me? In Ontario right now, the answer is going to be no. In BC, yeah, it could be yes, depending on the type of job. If there is no government mandate that applies to you, and your employer says, I don't care about government mandates, I'm deciding that vaccines are mandatory, and I'm going to let someone go if they haven't been vaccinated, that's a problem. That could be a human rights violation. Okay. So Sharon Higgins, if I refuse weekly testing, can they fire me, and would they have to give me severance, and how much? So yes, they could let you go, but they would have to pay you severance. Severance could be as much as 24 months pay. It's based on your age, your position, and the length of your employment. You haven't told me how long you've worked. You haven't told me your age and the type of job that you have. If you tell me those things, I can tell you how much severance you're owed. Oh, and by the way, for any of you that want to find out right now, this very moment, how much severance you're owed, easy. Just go to pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. Again, pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. You'll see our severance calculator tool there. You can find out in seconds for free and anonymously how much severance you're owed. So check it out, pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. All right, next question from YouTube from RM. Vaccinated people also spread COVID the same as unvaccinated. Is it kind of discriminatory that they are selecting unvaccinated one for the test? Well, I'm not going to talk about the medical aspect of it. We do know that vaccinated people can spread, but they potentially don't spread it as much. So bottom line is, yes, you can be required to have a COVID test if you have not been vaccinated. Kishan, what if I work for an auto company? Again, ultimately, the government has not imposed mandatory vaccines. So if your employer does, that could be illegal. If you lose your job, you really need to give me a call. Next question from Mark on YouTube. What about if you lost your job due to contracting COVID and suffering long-term effects? Is it grounds for termination? No, you cannot be let go because you had COVID or because you have long-term effects. That is an obvious human rights violation. If that's what happened to you, Mark, you got to give me a call right away. That's illegal, full stop, end of story right there. Illegal. My God, lots of questions. Kelly on Facebook. Is it mandatory to belong to a union if your organization has one? If your unions are not going to support, can you drop the union? No, you can't. If your position is unionized, you're unionized. You have no say in the matter other than quitting the job and going somewhere else. So that's the problem with being part of a union, is you don't have rights. As I said before, your union has rights. So your union can only pursue rights. You can't pursue rights on your own. Okay, and you can't give up on the union. You can't decide not to be unionized if the job that you're working in is a unionized job. And let's see. I have a question from from Ghana and West Africa complimenting me. Thank you. Kishin says that they're unionized. So again, you have to talk to your union. Very important in those situations. So I know we have questions about vaccines. Ultimately, remember, you can't physically stop your employer from letting you go, right? You can't. It's only a question of what they would owe you if they do let you go. So clearly severance is going to be owed if you lose your job because of the vaccine. But potentially, if in fact the policy is illegal, as I've been saying, there could be human rights damages that are owed as well. All right. So the fact that a vaccine mandate may be, or vaccine policy may be illegal, doesn't mean that there's a way to stop that, or it doesn't mean that there's a way to prevent your employer from letting you go. It's about the compensation that you may be owed if in fact you lose your job. From Tammy, what liabilities do the employer or union have if they mandate the vaccine and someone has a serious reaction, life-altering long-term effect? The problem is that no, the employer wouldn't have, or the union wouldn't have liability. Potentially the government may have liability, or the vaccine manufacturer may have liability, but not your employer, okay? So Sharon Higgins, how much severance would I be owed after I'm 55 and been there for 35 years? You'd be owed the maximum, Sharon, 24 months pay. So that's what's at stake for you. But before you do anything, because there's a lot at stake, excuse me, I want you to connect with me. I want you to call or email me before you do anything. But 24 months is what's at stake. And again, to reach out to me, employmentlawyer.ca. Carol asks, do you see this as a permanent mandatory position for long-term for employees, as they cannot get this virus controlled? Once the policy is in place, it usually is not reversed. No, I think that at some point, once COVID is under control and we don't have much spread in the community, I do think that government mandates are going to go away and employers are not going to mandate vaccines. That's my view on it. I don't think it will be necessary at some point. Who knows? I could be wrong. None of us expected that a year and a half later we'd still be dealing with this virus. So it's hard to say, but the idea, I think, is that these are going to be temporary measures. How temporary? We don't know. It depends on how much control we're going to have over this virus. Shannon asks, which provinces are you in? We operate in Ontario, BC, and Alberta. Okay, so we can help you. We've got your back in these 3 provinces. We can't help you in other provinces, but we can certainly provide a referral if you need some help. From Katie Mack, next question on Facebook. You have a couple last minutes, guys. Ask your question. What about wedding vendors? We aren't guests or directly employees of any venues. We work for the couple. Are we required to be vaccinated to work at the weddings? Wedding photographers, etc. No, you're not required. The question is, what happens if you don't? Legally, you cannot be mandated to be vaccinated. But if whoever you work for is going to say, I'm not going to allow you to work if you're not being vaccinated, the only option you'll have is to file a human rights complaint. So you have to decide, is it worth it to lose the business and file a human rights complaint, or is it better to get vaccinated? You have to decide, but it would be potentially a human rights violation if they mandated the vaccine and said, otherwise you don't get any work. Is that a good solution for you? That's up to you to say. From Razor Sharp, my employment contract has language that prohibits me from finding work in my industry for a few years after leaving the company. Can they do that? In most cases, unless you're a senior executive, Razor Sharp, this non-competition obligation would not be legal, would be unenforceable. But that's not the real issue. The real issue is whether your former employer or your current employer will try to enforce it and sue you if you go work in the industry. If they sue you, you'll win that lawsuit, but it's still going to take a long time and cost you a lot of money. So if you sign an employment agreement that prevents you from working for a competitor, you have to take it seriously, even though it may be unenforceable, because you want to always avoid a long, complicated, and expensive legal battle with your employer. RM has another question. A cousin has been on a medical leave for over a year. The doctor signed all the medical forms, and the insurance company supported the absence with no return to work. Can the employer let her go when she returns to work? If she's let go because she was off, that's illegal. If she's being let go because legitimately there's no work, then it is legal. Either way, she has to get full severance. But I would only have your cousin worry about that when she's ready to come back to work. Potentially could be illegal. And either way, full severance, as much as 24 months pay, would have to be paid. From Sharon, my son is going to Western University and not getting the vaccine. If he doesn't do the twice weekly testing, what would happen to him? You'd have to ask the university. They have a policy. Will they allow him on campus? Will they not? Will they allow him to study remotely? And again, that policy may be illegal, but the fact that it's illegal and your son would have to file a human rights complaint doesn't help him if he wants to go to university. So you have to ask the university, what does this mean for him? What if he doesn't do the testing? Can he still go to school? Can he study remotely? If they say, no, you're done, then they'll give you your money back and he can't go. That's a practical matter. Let's see. From Jackie, I know it is illegal for most employers in Ontario to demand their workers get vaccinated, but what about people who work in any medical profession? In Ontario, there isn't a mandatory vaccine mandate yet, okay? There isn't. So if in non-unionized settings, if the employer mandates it, as I've been saying, it's potentially illegal. Potentially, that employee could be entitled to human rights damages. But that does not stop the employer from letting the employee go. It's just a question of compensation and damages. So what's better? Ultimately, you have to decide. Am I better off losing my job and getting damages? Or am I better off continuing to work, get vaccinated, and not worry about that at all? That's a personal question, because the vaccine could be, or the mandatory vaccine imposed by an employer could be illegal. I think that's all the time that we have for this session. I will be back next week, but I know you have more questions. So don't wait another week to ask them. Contact me right now through employmentlawyer.ca. We can continue the conversation through email, by phone, and get your questions answered that way. We have a whole team just here to help you. So because of that, if you have questions, let's talk about it. I'll be back next week as well. Until then, guys, keep in mind what I said about mandatory vaccines. There's a lot of information on this session. You can always rewind it and watch it again if you want, or just reach out to me through employmentlawyer.ca. Have a good one, everyone. Thank you very much for all the wonderful questions today, and we'll talk to you soon.